security on the internet isn't great. It isn't all it should be. The data breaches are common and they're becoming more common still. Security on the internet is, in fact, poor. Just last month, a luxury hotel brand in Vietnam left their customer database exposed to the internet without any password at all. Data included booking details, flight information, their name, age, gender, phone number, email address, credit card information, including the number, the expiry date, and the CVV. The database was hosted on the same server as their website. It had no password whatsoever. After being notified, it took 2 weeks for them to add a password. I do hope they're keeping up with their security patches. More than a few years ago now, Mark Zuckerberg famously said that privacy should no longer be considered a social norm. Zuckerberg was right, at least at the time, but I think we're in a serious privacy backlash right now, or at least it's coming soon. I really don't think the current age where privacy can no longer be assumed is going to survive the coming of the Internet of Things. Because the amount of data that lives locked up, at least in theory, online is a lot smaller than the data that's still out in the world, distributed, scattered. The data isn't in the cloud because the systems that generate it aren't connected to a network, can't be connected to a network. They don't even have enough computing power to connect them to a network, at least not yet. And for this data, far more than the data we push up into the cloud, this makes up our data exhaust. Willingly, unwillingly, unknowingly, we leave data behind us every day. Shreds of our digital identity, if you will. Data as infrastructure, in other words. And if data is infrastructure, then just like any other infrastructure, it needs to be resilient. Always available when needed. Accessible and with access able to route around failures and damage. It can't drop offline because a data center goes down, or you've forgotten a domain renewal. Robust. The data must be verifiable and reliable, resistant to tampering. Scalable. Well, having vital bits of data just not appear if it becomes a popular data set is not going to work. And right now, the just like the Internet of Things, one of the other trendy things is called blockchain. Now, the blockchain concept isn't new. It's called blockchain because a slightly broken version of a Merkle tree doesn't sound quite as sexy. But there are possibilities here. If you take away the confusing cryptocurrency that surrounds it in most discussions, essentially blockchain is just a way to write a record, a log, if you will, and have that designed to be immutable, to have data written into them and then available forever. And that seems a desirable quantity to me. Nowadays, when most people say blockchain, and even when I say it myself, if you just substitute the phrase undefined radically distributed storage technology, you probably know more about it than the people talking about it. Because right now, the solution to everything in the Internet of Things is the cloud. Our connected devices talk to the cloud, our apps talk to the cloud, and in the cloud, therefore, most of the smarts reside. In the longer term, I think we're going to need to see a more mixed model with edge devices talking amongst themselves. Despite the fact this was a rant I had at the very first ThingMonk, it hasn't really seemed to start to happen yet. But privacy and security start to matter when the data has real physical implications to the user. For the most part, security on the digital internet is about confidentiality. For years, security industry has been trying to prevent data theft. Stolen data is used for identity fraud or other types of fraud. Can be embarrassing. The Ashley Madison breach springs to mind. Can also be damaging or even threat to national security. But all of these are breaches of privacy and confidentiality. The problems with the Internet of Things security are entirely different. For the Internet of Things, security isn't about confidentiality. It's not about the data anymore. Integrity and availability threats can be far more damaging for a connected device. And some classes of attack that would be a nuisance for a normal network device can be fairly disruptive for a connected device. This is especially true for devices with resource limited. So for instance, remote devices that rely on battery. If you have a denial of service attack that forces the radio to be continuously live, you drain the battery and the device stops working. And because we're not just embedding sensors, we're embedding actuators and controls, the denial of service attack takes on a whole new meaning. There's a big difference between knocking someone's website offline and locking them out of their own home. And of course, when I'm talking about denial of service attack, we're not just talking about bytes anymore. If something uses a consumable, you can force it to use it more quickly. And consider a device that's, say, flipping a relay on and off. If you flip the relay fast enough, you're probably going to break the large, expensive bit of kit that's connected to the internet. And while the concepts of mal-data and data spam aren't in wide circulation yet, they will be. For instance, feeding false data to your neighbor's soil sensors could lead them to under or overwater their crop, making your crop much more valuable. This is where blockchain-like concepts of data immutability might well come in handy for the Internet of Things. But I actually think that we may even have to start thinking about architectures where the actors aren't necessarily trusted. There's been some interesting work in agent architectures that discuss this. And I think going forward, being able to trust all of the bits and pieces, the connected devices, is not necessarily going to be a given. And that's even a single device. In an interconnected world, it's hard to predict the effects of one system on another. Over the weekend, ING's main data center in Bucharest, I think it was severely damaged by a fire extinguisher test. The system was overpressurized, and the loud noise when the halon extinguishers let go damaged dozens of hard drives because it actually pushed the read heads down into the platter. It took their entire data center offline for over 12 hours. And you might argue that this has nothing to do with the Internet of Things, privacy or security, but I'd argue very strenuously otherwise, because that almost inevitably brings us to Stuxnet. Now, just in case someone in the audience hasn't heard of Stuxnet, who's heard of Stuxnet? About half, okay. Stuxnet was a few years ago, so you're forgiven if you've not heard of it. This was the first piece of Internet of Things malware, essentially. It attacked in 3 phases. First, it targeted Microsoft Windows machines and networks, replicating itself. Then it sought out the Siemens Step 7 software, which is a bit of Windows-based software for controlling industrial control systems. Finally, it compromised the PLCs, the programmable logic controllers, attached to these boxes, but crucially only if they were operating a very small range of variable frequency drives, centrifuges in other words. The worm's authors could then spy on the industrial systems and then cause the fast-spinning centrifuges to tear themselves apart. Now, most speculation identifies Stuxnet targeting Iranian nuclear plants carrying out uranium enrichment. As many as 60% of the identified infected machines were in Iran. And the complexity of the worm implies that some sort of nation state is going to be behind it. I guess we can all guess which one there. However, if anyone thinks Stuxnet is unique, guess again. It's a high-profile leading indicator of what's going to happen next. There's going to be much softer targets out there than a uranium hexafluoride processing plant. The next big attack will trade sophistication for scale. So when you think about failure modes for the Internet of Things devices, you have to think about what the state of the device is when it fails, or if it simply loses its network connection. This is especially true for connected devices where the smarts actually live in the cloud and not in the device. The PetNet Smart Feeder is an automatic feeding device that manages portion size, food supply, and meal times for your pets through an iPhone application. Back in July, the PetNet servers went down, taking all of the PetNet smart feeders with them. The servers were down for around 12 hours. Some, not all of the feeders went down and stopped feeding their furry charges. What would have happened if the service had stayed down for longer? What about other network problems? The cat dies should never be a failure mode. Ever. This sort of thinking is not an isolated problem. Earlier this year, both Nest and Hive smart thermostats also went down. Similar thoughts of poorly thought out failure modes. The Nest froze its users, and the Hive baked them. The Nest case, it suffered a mysterious software bug that drained the batteries of the smart thermostat, putting people's homes into deep freeze throughout the middle of the night. It didn't happen to just a few customers, it happened to the bulk of the people with Nests around the United States of America. Fortunately, the ones in the UK didn't happen to, mostly. Unless you'd imported yours from the States and connected it to your house. Oops. The fault was tracked back to a firmware update in the thermostats 2 weeks before. The fix was a 9-step procedure that involved removing the thermostat from the wall with a screwdriver. In many cases, Nest had to dispatch engineers to the users' homes to fix the thermostat. And of course, the real difficulty for the Internet of Things security is that, unlike normal servers, Internet of Things are replicated thousands, millions of times. All of these embedded devices just sitting there with exactly the same software on them. If an attacker is able to build a successful exploit against one, suddenly they're exploiting against millions of these devices. Which is why there have now been 3 large-scale botnets solely consisting of CCTV cameras. I think the most recent was just last month. Right now, at least, IP cameras are one of the most vulnerable things in the entire Internet of Things. They're widely used, they're widely deployed, mostly by people that don't know a lot about them. And even when the manufacturers do publish security updates, which is not a given, most people don't apply them. Perhaps an even more scary example is this. This is the Hopra LifeCare PCA3 drug pump, better known as the least secure IP-enabled device ever built. Not only does it have a telnet server that gives you a root shell just by connecting to the device, it has an embedded web server and FTP server that have no authentication whatsoever and allow you to modify the device's functionality. The PCA pump also stores the wireless keys to connect to the rest of the hospital network in plain text on the device. That means anyone with physical access to the device can compromise the entire hospital device network, and these often turn up on eBay. Still configured to the configuration where they left the hospital. In 1995, you wore a digital watch that was also a calculator, and your house was filled with clocks doing this. In 2025, everything in your house will have an IP address, including your coffee mug. And for the same reasons, it's quite possible that the password will be whatever the manufacturer set the password to be in the first place. And that problem isn't helped by long life cycles. And most of the internet devices are going to be around for a decade or more. After all, the lifespan of your typical not smart thermostat. When was the last time you installed a thermostat in your house that wasn't smart? Why should consumers expect their smart thermostats to last any less amount of time? That said, a lot of the connected device companies are now producing what essentially abandonware. Some companies are handling this slightly better than others. One user referred to the $199 Revolve as, "That time Tony Fidel sold me a container of hummus." You can see the resemblance. This will be less of an issue, I hope, as the IoT matures. But the people in this space, those of us here in this room, are not used to thinking in decades. We're used to thinking in software that gets refreshed in 6 months or a year. iPhones that get repurchased every year for the latest, greatest device. I can tell you right now, I'm not going to purchase a new car every year, or a new thermostat, or every single light switch in my house. So if you're producing any of those, factor that into your design. And of course, once the piece of abandonware leaves your house, where does it go? An estimated 250,000 tons a year of used electrical products end up in West Africa and Asia. Their appliances are dismantled by unprotected workers, mostly children, who remove small pieces of metal to be sold. The remaining plastics and cables are almost always burnt. This is actually fairly well known to all of us. But what's less well known is they also salvage the hard drives out of these devices, and the data they're on are used for identity fraud. And you were worried about eBay? Of course, some vulnerabilities arise from how we're used to looking at security. In the past, a great deal of computer security has assumed the end user will have no physical access to the device. If an attacker has physical access, then there's no way to stop them compromising it. But the whole point of the Internet of Things is you hold the device in your hands. And seriously, would you trust this ATM? That's a Cisco router, and anyone that's played with Cisco routers know exactly how untrustworthy that now is. So physical access to the devices are going to be a real problem. This is the Ring Smart Doorbell. It's actually a really nice product. It sends an alert to your smartphone every time the doorbell is pressed. It's built-in camera, speaker, and microphone so you can see who is calling, even if you're away from home. Doorbell is fairly easily installed. It contains a battery good for a year, so you don't even have to connect it to wires. You just screw the backplate onto your wall and then attach the doorbell to your backplate. Unfortunately, it's attached to the backplate with two Torx T4 screws, similar to the ones the Apple uses to hold the iPhone together. That means anyone with access to a T5 screwdriver can remove the bell from your wall and push this orange button. This orange button places the Ring doorbell into its setup mode, and it creates its own wireless access point. At that point, you used to be able to retrieve the SSID and key for the last wireless network it was connected to. Just to be clear, that was your home network. Fortunately, this bug was resolved in the January firmware patch for Ring. Fitbit's ARIA scales also suffer from almost exactly the same security problem, except all you have to do is flip the scales over and push the button on the back. Ever have a party at your house and someone's used the bathroom? Well, if you didn't let them on their Wi-Fi network, they may well know the Wi-Fi password anyway. The reasons why both of these devices suffered from this very similar problem is they both relied on the same underlying chip. The firmware of the onboard radio hardware is actually where the problem is, and the manufacturer of the radio hardware is, in fact, totally disinclined to fix it. They don't care. This is the iKettle. It has a very similar problem. Although you don't even have to actually physically access the kettle to breach it. You can drive by the owner's house, force it off the owner's Wi-Fi network, and then it's trivial to log in because due to a coding flaw, the PIN number for the kettle is never actually updated from the device. It always uses its default PIN number. Isn't that great? Once you have control, you can force the kettle to turn itself on and stay that way. The best case is you're driving up the owner's electricity bill. The worst case is, well, worse. One of the things you should worry about with this lack of security is that the parallels to the bring your own device culture, bring your own thing culture is going to be obvious. You can see someone bringing a smart kettle into the office very, very easily. And no one ever mentions smart fridges, right? Like, we shouldn't talk about that anymore. Things as well as devices are starting to appear in the office. And while the Internet of Things has its roots in the web architectures of the .com era, the industrial internet has its roots in the SCADA systems of the late 60s. Suddenly these web era devices are sitting on the same local network as the industrial control systems that were never designed to have any security in the first place. And the minimal security that is being thrown over the legacy SCADA systems before they're exposed to the public network are oftentimes laughable. One of the places this is really evident is the hotel industry. Now, I've had a couple of interesting war stories about my own stays in hotels and the connected devices they're in. And I've told them quite a lot recently, so I'm not going to tell them again. But I'm not the only one. I'm not alone. This is a hack from Matthew Garrett. He ran across one hotel in which they'd replaced all the light switches with Android tablets. all of the light switches. Poking around for a little while, he discovered that the tablets were communicating with the smart devices in the hotel, the lights and the blinds, using Modbus over TCP. Modbus, for anyone that doesn't know about it, is a trivial protocol and has absolutely no authentication whatsoever. Once he'd figured out the gateway, he could access the control systems in every floor of the hotel and now query every other room in the hotel and figure out whether the lights were on or off, which strongly implies he could control them as well. He claims he didn't. I believe him. I think most people are looking at security around the Internet of Things entirely the wrong way. They have it backwards. Right now, there are 3 problems with the Internet of Things. These are security, refresh cycle, and standards. And we only ever seem to discuss security when we talk about standards. And we don't discuss the refresh cycle at all, even when we're talking about standards. And the whole purpose of security is to protect people, not computers. And right now we're failing to do that. We are not protecting people. Everyone in this room that builds a connected device is failing at their job. And that actually makes me sort of angry. And some of you might laugh, but engineers like us built all of the things I talked about here, all of the stupid devices I talked about here, and all of the many, many more that I didn't have time to talk about. Someone somewhere thought that these things were a good idea. That a hospital, a drug pump that had no encryption, no authentication at all, was a good idea. Don't be that someone. Thank you.